Forget everything you think you know about psychopaths and sociopaths. Pop culture and Hollywood has blurred the lines, but the scientific community shares clear definitions of very clear differences between psychopaths and sociopaths. And today, what we are going to do is we're going to break down some of the common misconceptions between a psychopath and a sociopath, revealing some of the more relatable, reliable academic definitions that separate these two chilling conditions. We're going to look at a couple of examples as well and see if you can determine if they are a psychopath, a sociopath, or neither. Welcome back to True Crime and Tea, where we look at true crime cases and we spill some of the academic tea behind these true crime cases. Today's a little bit different in the sense that we will be looking at some true crime cases, but we will be looking at them to differentiate whether these people are a psychopath or a sociopath or neither. I have about 4 different examples, and you are going to tell me in the comments whether you think they are a psychopath or a sociopath, and if you got it right, because I will reveal who and what they are at the end. So first of all, what are some of the key characteristics, the key differences between a psychopath and a sociopath? Because we can see that the portrayal of some of these personalities in the public media sometimes gets distorted. A psychopath is a complex personality disorder. It carries its very own distinct traits, especially when it comes to the emotional processing and interpersonal behaviors and moral reasoning. So some of the core traits of a sociopath are the emotional response. So the emotional response tends to be shallow, it lacks empathy, and they have an inability to feel remorse. Their behavioral patterns are more calculated, they're more controlled, they're less impulsive than a sociopath. They are able to plan how they're going to act. They do have some interpersonal skills, but in the sense that they are able to manipulate people easier. They have superficial charm, they have this feeling of superiority and grandiose behavior. They give off the sense that they are better than everybody else, whilst at the same time convincing people that they should love and adore them because they are such easy manipulators. They find it very easy to manipulate people. In terms of moral reasoning, they completely disregard societal norms. They don't fit into what we would see as normal in general society, and they often view other people as a means to an end. They view them as tools to be able to achieve and accomplish whatever they set out to do. They disregard societal norms, they disregard rules, and they completely disregard laws, which is probably why we are able to identify more so psychopaths over sociopaths, because of the true crime umbrella and criminal patterns. We assume that most of these criminals fall into the psychopath bucket because they completely disregard rules, laws, and societal norms. They don't have any regard for any of those things. In terms of relationships, they have difficulty forming genuine emotional bonds. That doesn't mean they are unable to form emotional attachments and emotional bonds. It's just that they don't really have the ability for that to be a genuine attachment, which kind of goes hand in hand with being able to easily manipulate people and situations. They see people as tools, which means the relationships that they do build up, those emotional bonds that they do build, a lot of the time they generally have those relationships because they are going to use that person to achieve an outcome. They often use relationships as an exploitative element. It's not there for personal benefit or personal gain for either person. It's more they're exploiting the person that they're with. And some additional indicators, we'll look more into detail into each of those things, but some of the additional indicators are a grandiose sense of self-worth. They believe that they are superior and they are untouchable, which can sometimes be present in the criminal behavior, especially those that go undetected for many, many years. Their sense of self-worth is way superior to others because they haven't been caught, so therefore they're better than everyone else. However, they lack the ability to be realistic about long-term goals. Despite the appearance of being successful, their plans are often self-serving and quite clearly unsustainable, or generally unsustainable. They fail to accept responsibility. They often shift the blame from themselves onto someone else. They're quite well known for blame shifting, even when the evidence is quite apparent, it's very overwhelming. They will not take that accountability on themselves. They will easily shift that blame over to someone else. So while both psychopathy and sociopathy fall under the personality disorder umbrella, psychopaths tend to be more cold, calculated, and emotionally detached. They don't have any links emotionally to anyone, whereas sociopaths tend to have more emotional outbursts and they are very, very impulsive. They can't plan effectively. Their emotion causes them to act on impulse. They tend to be emotionally volatile. There is examples that we will look at where it's often cited that Ted Bundy, for example, was a textbook case for one of these two things because of the way that he presented himself. So just generically, psychopathy tends to be more neurological, whereas sociopathy tends to be social and environmental in its origin. Let's have more of a deeper look into the different responses, such as the emotional, behavioral, and relational responses that are present in both of these personality disorders. Emotional response. Psychopaths have been researched consistently, and what has been found with psychopaths is that they exhibit a pathological lack of empathy, guilt, and emotional depth. Sometimes it's termed as affective poverty because their emotional attachment just doesn't really exist. And what we see on the neurological side of it is that there's a reduction in amygdala and prefrontal cortex activity. There is the diminished autonomic arousal to emotion, that when those areas of the brain are stimulated, they have an impairment to emotional learning, meaning that at some point in the developmental phase, there may have been damage to these areas, or there just wasn't the ability to develop an understanding and learn how to be emotional. So when there is stimuli to these sections of the brain, there's no present activity, or the activity is greatly reduced. And psychopaths are often strikingly unaffected by their own or other people's distress. They display a limited internalization of anxiety and fear. They don't feel fear, they don't generally have anxiety, and they rarely appear genuinely remorseful, even in the face of serious harm to others. They are unable to feel sorry for someone. They are unable to feel. Essentially, there is no remorse, there is no empathy in terms of going into a dangerous situation. They don't feel fear and they don't feel anxiety, essentially. Maybe some have an inkling of it, of those feelings, but the research has shown that those activity centers, or those parts of the brain, they don't show the activity when they are put in stressful situations. Now, the complete contrast to that is the sociopath. So sociopaths and sociopathy is characterized by greater emotional labeling. There is more emotion linked to sociopathy, and they're characterized by greater emotional liability and impulsive responses, with frequent outbursts of rage and frustration. However, they do have the capacity at times to feel guilt or attachment. Even though that presents very inconsistently, they do still have the propensity to have the feelings of guilt or remorse. Sociopaths are often prone to emotional volatility, which means they have a lower threshold for anger. They will have very few things that can trigger a violent or angry response, and this is what leads to criminal acts committed in the heat of the moment. You know, when you see a lot of the cases and someone lashed out and, oh, I just snapped, those tend to be in that umbrella of sociopathy, because they act on impulse, they act on emotion, they don't have the ability to control that their emotions, so they have greater outbursts. And there is amygdalic hyperactivity and structural deficits related with poor emotional regulation or poor emotion regulation. That is what has been observed with people with antisocial personality disorder, which is the umbrella that sociopathy falls into. But it differs in the activity differs in the pattern from the blunted neurological activity of a sociopath. The responses that they see from a sociopath are greatly reduced, whereas the ones with a psychopath are greatly reduced, but the ones with a sociopath, there is different activity when it comes to that emotional stimuli. So the comparison here is that sociopaths are blunt and they're able to strategically mask emotion or strategically mask emotional responses, where sociopaths, they experience emotional storms. They have poor emotional regulation, and what that does is leads to outbursts and impulsive aggressive behavior. So if you was to see that in an image, you'd see a very pale, blunt, non-responsive image on the sociopath side, and somewhat of an uncontrolled, chaotic, very, very colourful person on the other side. They are two almost polar opposites. So in terms of the behavioral patterns, psychopaths are what can be labeled as the controlled manipulator. The behavior in psychopathy is typically controlled, it's strategic, and it's manipulative. We have looked at H.H. Holmes, for example, and there was the argument that he was less impulsive as Jack the Ripper. He was able to strategize how he was going to commit his homicides. He was very controlled. It was in a very controlled environment, being the murder castle that he used. And looking at H.H. Holmes and the way he presented himself, he was very able to fake normality. He was able to maintain relationships with business relationships like he had with Benjamin, or emotional, not so much emotional, but he had relationships with Benjamin's wife, with his wife. He broke down in court when his wife was in court and he saw her. He had somewhat of an emotional bond with his wife, which kind of goes, he doesn't fall under the psychopath because of that reason, but he does because he was the manipulator and he was able to control his environment. The psychopath is very adept at faking normality, like Dennis Rader, BTK. They're able to maintain a whole family life. He was able to maintain a whole family life, take a break from the SK life for a little while, being the lead in his church. He was able to choose when he returned back to his homicides because he was so adept at faking normality. His behavioral pattern allowed him to be so controlled and so much of a manipulator that he was able to fake family life. But that feeling of being better than everyone else, that grandiose sense of self-worth, was the reason why he went back into being BTK. That, and probably the feelings inside, but those feelings inside were prompted by things like grandiose feelings of self-worth. No one was acknowledging him as BTK, and he wanted and was able to control the situation until he eventually got caught. Employing superficial charm and calculated deceit to exploit others is often what is seen under the psychopath umbrella, and that is for personal pleasure and personal gain. Dennis Rader was getting absolutely nothing from not being recognized as BTK, therefore he went back into doing what he was doing. Side note, this is not me saying that BTK is a psychopath. This is me just drawing a comparison between his behaviors and what we see a psychopath, some of their attributes, what they are. In this sense, a psychopath is known to be able to maintain emotional composure. They're able to maintain emotional composure when they are executing their crimes. And even when this involves extreme cruelty, you have to have a switch just not turned on to be able to do some of the things that these SKs do. And they're often described as cold-blooded and predatory, which is very, very apparent in some of the cases that we have seen. In comparison to this, a sociopath is an extremely poor planner. So they can come under we can call them the poor planner, and they're impulsive. Sociopathic behavior tends to be way more impulsive, poorly planned, and they are prone to emotional dysregulation. Their crimes tend to be more opportunistic and not as well concealed as the psychopath's crime. For example, again, we're going back to a previous video we've spoken about, H.H. Holmes. In that video, we discussed the impulsivity of Jack the Ripper, and he essentially didn't successfully conceal his crimes because he just left women out in the open. Or we have someone like Richard Ramirez, who was quite impulsive, but also didn't really hide his identity from people. So it's very easy to identify the people that he attacked. They were easily able to identify who he was, hence why they was able to do a sketch of him. And because of his recklessness, he was caught by the general public, and they were able to easily identify who he was. They gave him a bit of hustle and tussle, and then they handed him into the police, and that's how he ended up getting caught. Can we say that he was a sociopath? No, because I haven't done the research into that. However, his actions do seem to be quite impulsive. His actions don't seem to be controlled. He didn't really seem to be a manipulator. But the scenarios that he ended up putting himself in allowed him to be easily identified. Because they are so impulsive and they are unable to regulate their emotions, sociopaths tend to engage in repeated, dangerous, violent acts, and they are unable to evade detection because they are so poor at executing their outbursts. So they will not be able to clean up a crime scene effectively, or they will act out of emotion and then leave their fingerprints all over the crime scene. And they are often driven by an immediate need to act out their emotion. Their immediate emotional needs or provocation, they're provoked into acting a certain way, is what drives them, which often results in the repetitive failure at formative social roles. So they're not good in employment, they're not good in relationships. A lot of the cases that I've been researching that will be coming up tend to be people who they act off of their emotion, and they have a few wives that leave them or a few husbands that leave them because they are so impulsive. And it doesn't just mean impulsive in the terms of violently impulsive. It could mean a husband who repetitively cheats on his wife. Therefore, the wife is sick of being, treated the way she's being treated and she leaves. Or they are repeatedly in a DV situation and the wife ends up leaving, but the husband moves on to another family and just continues that pattern of behavior. So sociopaths are very unable to stop the repetition. Their inability to regulate their emotions doesn't allow them to act differently in different situations. Relationship dynamics. Sociopaths are recognized for being superficially charming, but fundamentally they are manipulative in relationships with others. They only form shallow bonds with people, generally using social charm to deceive, to exploit and disregard others without feelings of remorse or genuine attachment to those people. Cleckie, who is the originator of these definitions, famously described this kind of behavior as the mask of sanity, which is the ability to mimic normal affect while lacking an authentic connection or concern. There are some psychopaths out there who would be diagnosed as psychopaths but are able to live somewhat normal lives without being SKs and abusers and things like that. The research into why psychopaths are this way inclined, it has been found that they mistrust others, they mistrust loyalty, they lack empathy, and they view others as instruments, tools, things they can use to achieve a target, a goal. And they're often known to cultivate this facade of intimacy that quickly dissolves when it is under scrutiny, when it's being observed, or when the relationship no longer serves its purpose. They no longer are interested in maintaining the relationship, that relational bond. That's not necessarily a intimate relationship. That could be a work relationship. It doesn't have to be that way. It could just be a business relationship that no longer suits them. For example, H.H. Holmes' business relationship with Benjamin. Benjamin was getting on his nerves. He thought, Benjamin's going to get us in trouble. So he got rid of him and he got the money from it. That's the kind of behavior and relational dynamic that you will see in a psychopath. Whereas sociopaths they're generally less skilled at manipulating. They're not able to manipulate relationships for long-term gain, and they're more likely to fall into instability, aggressive or dysfunctional partnerships. They may come from dysfunctional families, they may come from abusive families, because we know sociopaths are born through environment. That is how they have developed to become sociopaths. So they are sometimes able to display some attachment, but without consistency, and it lacks depth. They're not able to sustain the relationships that they get themselves into, the attachments and the bonds that they develop. They cannot maintain them long term, and this is mainly owing to their impulsivity and their emotional inability, their emotional volatility, which often leads to tumultuous interpersonal histories and alienation. They can't keep their emotions in check. Therefore, the relational bonds that they develop end up suffering as a result of that. They will get into relationships fast-paced, in love, amazing, and something will happen. They will have an outburst and that relationship is ruined. Or in the workplace, they get a job, great in employment for a couple of months. Someone does something that ticks them off, they have an outburst, they get fired. That's generally the pattern that we see in sociopaths. So in terms of crime planning and execution, the sociopath is able to demonstrate a pronounced capacity for elaborate premeditated and often highly successful criminal activity. The classical criminal psychopath can plot very, very complex homicides and offences, not just homicides. They can plan very, very effective offences. They can evade detection for very long periods of time, and they can skillfully manipulate the police or law enforcement, the legal system, and even the media portrayal of them. For example, the date night killer, his name was Rodney Akala. He was able to evade detection for pretty long time. He did commit a few crimes and end up getting some prison time for those crimes, but he never really was, they never sustained his prison term. Like, he would easily get out because of his charm, supposedly. But he was even brazen enough to go on a dating show and be right at the front, in front of the media, portraying himself as this very, very charming, amazing guy, manipulating not only the people to get onto the show, but the audience that watched him were kind of enamored with him, and he ended up getting picked. It's a scary thought to think, given the fact that up to that point he had committed a lot of crimes. And I think the show, I can't remember if it was, but I think the show was the reason why he got caught. But even the woman that picked him on the show, it's scary to think what would have happened if she had actually gone on the date with him. She didn't go on the date with him because she said he creeped her out a little bit and chose to not go in the end. However, it's still a scary thought to think that he got picked, even though his answers were really rubbish, but she still picked him because he was charming. So, bit concerning. With the sociopath, their behaviour is typically instrumental. It is goal focused rather than affective. It's not emotionally driven. Their violence is planned, purposeful and emotionless, and it's a calculated pursuit of material power or control over their targets. And this has been supported over many clinical reviews, forensic assessments, and neurobiological literature, which links the reduced fear response to the increased risk-taking and successful deception. Because they are not scared of being caught, they will take more risks. In contrast, again to this, the sociopath's crimes that they commit are frequently impulsive. They are disorganized, they are emotionally reactive, and they often result from intoxication, personal disputes, or an acute emotional arousal. And generally, their offences are less likely to be planned, they're more likely to fail, and they're more likely to reoffend because of poor self-regulation and unsuccessful attempts to adapt to the societal expectations. I was watching a case recently where he ended up being a serial killer who did act on impulse but was scared of being caught. He was very, very scared of the women that he attacked, and he got caught every single time, but for some reason he never did a prison term. He always got like a slap on the wrist until the final few times. And the first few times were sexual assaults, and obviously then he ended up unaliving women and leaving them in the desert. But that was he acted off impulse because he felt like he needed to fulfill a desire that he had. He ended up breaking his virginity with one of his victims, because up until that point, I think he was 31 at the time, he'd never had that kind of interaction. But he was very, very chaotic and impulsive and weird. Successful psychopaths are well documented as individuals who, although they lack a conscience and empathy, they function successfully in professions that rely on calculation, risk, and manipulation. They can be, not saying that these people are, but they can be corporate executives, politicians, and even surgeons. We have seen many cases actually where there's been someone in healthcare who is unaliving people on the wards, and death just seems to follow them. These are the type of people that are able to maintain jobs, and quite good jobs at that. Their capacity for blending into society and what we see as normal society is a product of their cognitive acuity, their charm, their emotional detachment. They don't care, and that is a key reason for their under detection. The inability for law enforcement to be able to catch them after the first few is because they are so adept at blending into society. Whereas sociopaths, they struggle to integrate into what we see as normative social or work environments because they don't have the ability to control their feelings, their emotions. They fail to maintain employment, relationships, or just the societal responsibilities like raising children. How many of the cases that you've seen are of fathers who have loads of wives because they've had one wife, they've been abusive in that relationship to the wife and the children, the wife has left, and that just keeps on happening. They're unable to fulfill their societal responsibilities. Their impulsivity and inconsistency preclude the sustained strategic success that is often seen in psychopathy. They're not charming, they're not manipulators, they're chaotic. There is a psychopathy checklist, or it's called the Hare Psychopathy Checklist, the PCL-R, which is now known as the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, is a psychological assessment tool that is used to assess the presence of psychopathy in individuals, and it's most often seen in institutions such as the criminal justice system. It's generally used to see if these criminals, maniacs, serial killers, repeat offenders, rapists are falling under the bracket of psychopath. And it's used to differentiate those high in this trait from those who present antisocial personality disorder and any other related diagnosable disorders. One of the people on the following list is a very, very clear illustration of a psychopath in criminological literature and clinical assessments, because multiple sources have placed his PCLR score as 39 out of 40, with most of the core psychopathic traits validated in his life history and criminal modus operandi. So that being said, let's get on to the next segment and let's discuss some of the characters that we know, and let's decide whether we think they are a psychopath or a sociopath. Disclaimer, some of these are fictional, obviously. The fictional ones I still want you to be able to differentiate, because it will show how Hollywood has Hollywoodized some of these characteristics and how pop culture blurs the lines between the two and sometimes tends to merge psychopath with sociopath, leading to the challenge of being able to differentiate whether these characters or these people are a psychopath or a sociopath. There are going to be some conflicting theories, but in the comments I want you to tell me whether you guessed correctly, whether you disagree, and if there's anyone else you think I should add it to the list. So the first person that we have on the list is the Joker. Yes, I know, I just went straight in there with one of my favorites. He's actually one of my favorite characters, the Joker from DC Comics. There are many depictions of the Joker. There have been many depictions of the Joker over the years, but generally, what do you think the Joker is? He a psychopath? Is he a sociopath? I'll give you some time to think. There are conflicting theories about the Joker, and the general consensus is that the Joker exhibits traits of both. And this is because psychopathy is characterized by a lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, and grandiose sense of self-worth, which the Joker does display through his cunning and violent actions in some of the comics. Not all, some of the comics. Whereas the sociopath involves erratic behavior, impulsivity, and a lack of emotional connection, or a lack of maintaining emotional connections. The Joker also displays some of these traits, particularly in his chaotic and very, very unpredictable nature. Some articles and sources would argue that the Joker's psychopathic traits dominates the other traits that he exhibits. Both types of personality disorders reflect his multifaceted character, but some sources will say that the psychopathy dominates the sociopath. But again, the sociopath element can be a bit subjective, and it varies depending on which interpretation of his behavior we see across the very broad media portrayals of the Joker. For example, I would argue that he demonstrates maybe more psychopathy because he lacks empathy, but he does have a disturbing emotional attachment to Bruce Wayne / Batman that prevents him from unaliving him, as well as allowing others to reveal his secret identity. He won't allow others to reveal the secret identity of Batman. There was one comic where someone found out that Batman was Bruce Wayne, and it wasn't just the Joker. There was a group of people, but the Joker was adamant that this person needed to be gotten rid of because he cannot have people knowing who Batman is, and it's almost like he needs him to fuel the madness. But also, given the fact that most of his acts are pretty well planned, yes, they are chaotic, but they're pretty well planned and grandiose. But there does take some kind of planning behind a lot of his actions. So I don't know, I feel like he's less impulsive and erratic and more of a planner. Plus, he's able to easily manipulate gangsters and those kind of people into fitting into his long-term plans, and then when he's done with them, he gets rid of them. So it does kind of depend on the media portrayal of the Joker's characters. We've seen many over the times, and it may be that one portrayal of the Joker is more of a psychopath compared to another, which is more of a sociopath. So it really does depend on the media portrayal. Probably not the best example. Let's move on. The next one is also a fictional character. I promise you that the two after this are real characters, but I needed to do some non-fiction because this is quite a heavy topic, and true crime can be heavy. As much as I do like true crime, it does take a lot out of you doing the research into these things. And the next few cases that I have planned to do and I have researched really drained me. So I needed to get some fiction in there, you know? So the next character is Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal Lecter is a fictional character who was created by Thomas Harris, and he first appears in the novel The Red Dragon. There is also a film, The Red Dragon, which is a very good film. You should watch it. But the book was published in 1981, and it gained widespread recognition through, or the Hannibal Lecter himself, the character, gained widespread recognition through the film The Silence of the Lambs, where Hannibal Lecter was played by Anthony Hopkins. Very, very good film. You should watch it. There are 2 serial killers in that film, and they are both based on, I mean, there's some elements of realism in this character anyway, but you can see there's elements of other people in the other character who's crazy. Now, Lecter is a cultured psychiatrist, and he is a cannibalistic serial killer. So there's a hint there of what umbrella he comes under. He apparently captivates audiences with his charm and his intelligence. He is very manipulative. He has very manipulative behavior. There is a series called Hannibal on Netflix, also a very good series. It has Larry Fishburne in it. Hannibal is played by, I think the actor is French. I cannot remember his name, but he's such a good actor. It's a good series. But he's very able to blend into society. He maintains relationships, and he can perform in very, very high stakes situations, which suggests he is calculated by nature. For instance, his interactions in The Silence of the Lambs with the FBI agent Clarice, who is played by Jodie Foster, reveal his skill in manipulating others to serve his own interests, because their interactions inevitably end up causing him to be able to escape and go on to continue his madness. He does get arrested. He is kept under tight lockdown, and because of his work that he does with Clarice, he ends up escaping whilst unaliving a couple of people along the way. He had a traumatic childhood, which was marked by violence and abandonment, which kind of hint towards sociopathic tendencies. But I don't know if you've guessed where I'm going with this. He's another one who is claimed to display both sociopathic and psychopathic tendencies. There's both psychopath and sociopath in this character, because he has a lack of emotional attachment, but he is somewhat impulsive. But he also clearly displays characteristics of the lack of empathy, superficial charm, and very, very manipulative behavior. I would say there is an instance in the film, if you haven't seen it, where he is being transferred between one place to the next, and he basically unalives the officer that was looking after him or watching over him. And it could be argued that that was impulsive. However, I feel like it wasn't impulsive, because he used the officer as a tool, like he used Clarice to achieve his end goal, which was escaping. So I would say that it can be seen as impulsive, but it can also be seen as very calculated. But his manipulative tendencies highlight his chilling ability to be, it highlights his intellect basically. And in Red Dragon, the psychiatrist that he sees, called Will Graham, refers to him as a sociopath. But this could be that he refers to him in this way because at this point he doesn't know him well enough yet to identify that actually he may be a psychopath. So it can be said that even though he clearly lacks empathy and he's very, very manipulative, it can be said that because he is a fictional character, he embodies an amalgamation of other real life characters. And it was written in 1981. Red Dragon was written in 1981, and up until that point I can't think of there wasn't many high profile cases that he could fall into. Obviously the writer would have done a lot of research, but it's important to remember that because he doesn't clearly fall into either definition, he still displays personality disorder, he still displays antisocial personality disorder. So he could be on the fence, but generally that doesn't happen. The next one though, there's definitely an answer. So let's move on. Theodore Bundy, Ted Bundy. Now, we probably all know who Ted Bundy is, and I don't know if I'm going to do a whole video on him. Maybe I will, because there's some elements of him that I want to explore further, but there's so many videos on him that I just don't know. So we'll see. But Ted Bundy's criminal activity began in the early 70s, and he abducted, sexually assaulted and murdered numerous young women across several states, including Washington, Utah and Colorado. His charming appearance and intelligence allowed him to manipulate both his victims and the authorities. He clearly falls into a bucket. What buckets do you think he falls into? You guessed it, he's a psychopath. Ted Bundy is classified as on the psychopath PCLR checklist. He demonstrated traits such as charm, manipulation, a lack of empathy, which are all characteristics of psychopathy, and experts including Harvey Cleckley, who was one of the ones that come and coined this term, diagnosed him as a psychopath, highlighting that his calculated behavior and his brutal action, even though he was quite impulsive in certain instances, he was definitely a psychopath. While the terms psychopath and sociopath sometimes get used interchangeably, they are not the same thing. Bundy's behavior is more closely linked with psychopath, and obviously it has been proved through the assessment that he is a psychopath. He consistently displays patterns of deceit and emotional detachment, which is weird because he was able to maintain relationships in the sense that he did have a couple of girlfriends. The first girlfriend, I would argue, is a large contributing factor to some of the women that he unalived, because they looked really, really similar. And though he had somewhat of a rocky upbringing, we know that psychopathy is not an emotional, it's not born out of emotion, it's born out of a neurological issue. Whether that means that in his early childhood he had a head injury, or he was just born with that amygdala not working, he was just sick. So yeah, he did have a few girlfriends, and one of his girlfriends had a daughter which he had built a pretty decent relationship with. So the emotional detachment element was there because obviously he was able to commit homicides without remorse, other than one that he refused to admit to, and that was the homicide of a 12-year-old girl. And I think he did admit to doing it, but he would never talk about that case in particular. So we could argue that could be a bit of remorse, or that could just be him keeping that one little bit of information to himself. But he was proven to be a psychopath. My final person I will be doing a story on, and this is where Bundy may make an appearance again. It is along the lines of nature versus nurture, but this one that we're talking about, we want to see if we can identify whether he was a psychopath or a sociopath. And this serial killer is Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. Yes, many people have spoken about him. There are loads of books, loads of articles, loads of journals, programs, videos, movies about Jeffrey Dahmer. So we know who he was. If you are a true crime buff, you know who Jeffrey Dahmer was. If you're watching this, you probably know who Jeffrey Dahmer was. So Jeffrey Dahmer was an American serial killer and sex offender who murdered 17 men and boys between the years of 1978 and 1991. The homicides involved rape, dismemberment, necrophilia, and cannibalism. Yeah, he just... yuck. On November the 28th, 1994, he was beaten to death by an inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution, where he was incarcerated after being charged with the 17 homicides. And like I said, there have been many books, articles written about him, and Hollywood have Hollywoodized his life and his crimes. Most recently was the Dahmer series on Netflix, where we know that not all the details were accurate, which is why we could say Hollywoodized. And he was even made a bit likable by Evan Peters. It seems like Evan Peters playing him, it seemed to make Dahmer more of a likable character. But actually, when you compare him compare the Evan Peters Dharma to the man, the real person, especially given that the impression we got from the Netflix series was that he was a quiet, compliant inmate, it was not who Jeffrey Dahmer was. He was not a likable person. He was an alcoholic. He served in the army in Germany for a couple of years, and even though he was honorably discharged, which I don't understand how he can get honorably discharged given the fact that he was seen many times by psychiatrists and counselors who encouraged him to quit drinking. He refused to put down the liquor but was still given an honorable discharge, which meant that he would still get his benefits. He would still be recognized honorably as being in the army. I don't see how I think that's weird. But he was also known for being somewhat of an antagonist in prison prior to the person unaliving him. And he was unalived by a severely mental ill inmate who suffered with auditory hallucinations. This isn't pardoning what he's done, it's just giving a bit of a backstory. He was unalived or beaten by this severely ill inmate who suffered with auditory hallucinations, who said that the family in his head was telling him to do things. And I personally think, and I know other creators on YouTube think the same, I personally think that he was set up to kill Dahmer and the other inmate that was unalived, because the officers were conveniently not around when they were both left alone with this severely ill, mentally ill inmate who attacked and killed them. Like, they was put together to work, and then the officers just decided, yeah, I'm going to go on a break. Bit weird. Also, given the fact that both of these men were accused of being racist, and he was killed by a black man. But it's just an observation. Many others have made the same observation. I don't know. But we're talking about whether he was a psychopath or a sociopath. So, given his crimes and his backstory, do you think that he was a psychopath or a sociopath? Jeffrey Dahmer is actually is generally considered to not be a psychopath or a sociopath. Experts have suggested that he may have had borderline personality disorder. A neuroscientist called James Fallon stated that Dahmer exhibited some emotional empathy, which is often absent in psychopaths, which leads to the conclusion that he didn't fit into the profile of a psychopath. Additionally, the behavior that he presented and his early life influences have been analysed to understand his actions, and the general consensus leans towards BPD, border personality disorder, rather than psychopathy. That doesn't actually say that he's not a sociopath though, actually, because it could be argued that he could have also had antisocial personality disorder. I'm not saying that he does. I'm just saying that opens the door to say he probably could be diagnosed as a sociopath. It's just that they've said he's not a sociopath. So yeah, that's the four. The Joker was on the fence. Hannibal Lecter is also a bit of both, but more so psychopath. Ted Bundy, clear psychopath, 39 out of 40 on the PCLR. And Jeffrey Dahmer is not a psychopath. Don't know if he is a sociopath, but he does have borderline personality disorder, or did have, because he's got now. Yeah. So today we have dived into the perspectives on sociopathy and psychopathy. Now, a question we can ask ourselves is, can early intervention or specific therapeutic approaches mitigate these traits, especially in sociopathy? And I would argue as well in psychopathy, especially when we have a lot of the research behind how head injuries can impact someone's frontal cortex and the amygdalic activities. Is it possible for early interaction to make a difference with people that are suffering with these tendencies? It's a fascinating question that opens up a world of possibilities for health professionals and researchers alike. Understanding these distinctions has profound societal implications, and it impacts criminal justice, mental health support, and public perception, because public perception does play a key in how we view these people. So by recognizing the differences between psychopathy and sociopathy, we can tailor our approaches to treatment and possibly rehabilitation. I am of the understanding and belief that not everybody can be rehabilitated. Some people just need to be put in a padded room with bread and water. But this can potentially lead to better outcomes for individuals and society as a whole. As we conclude today, I encourage you to critically evaluate the common portrayals of psychopathy and sociopathy, especially in Hollywood and the media portrayals, because what we see as references of a psychopath are not always that. And we need to consider the complex interplay of biology and environmental factors in human behavior. It's not just about labeling. I made a video a little while ago at I think I said it in the Vampire of Sacramento, this video, where I said labeling can kill, because the view of labels sometimes puts a stigma behind what we consider these people and their behaviors to be. So it's not just about labeling someone as a psychopath or a sociopath. It's about understanding the underlying factors that contribute to these behaviors. Also understanding that we probably work with sociopaths, we probably work with psychopaths. They do not all turn into Ted Bundy, Ed Kemper, Jeffrey Dahmer, the giggling granny, the antifreeze ladies. There are so many, but they don't all turn into these people. There are some that are living generally normative societal lives. So we need to understand the behaviors in order to be able to manage and change public perception of these behaviors. Or maybe not change public perception, but have an understanding of these behaviors. So, as usual, thank you for joining me today. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more insights into the world of true crime. And I will see you in the next video. Bye. It's that word again. A grandiose. I need tea. And sociopathy. So sociopaths are recognized for superficially. What the heck? Wow, like somebody did just punch me in the throat. Oi, I need a drink. Understanding. Okay.